Hey guys, so today is going to be a different style video, but I'm joined here by a special guest. I've mentioned him a couple times in my previous videos, but this is my husband Tachi, so welcome.
Hey guys, I'm Tachi, and I play Vengeance Demon Hunter. I started playing Havoc in Season 3, and then I pivoted to tanking, and it was my first real experience tanking Mythic Plus dungeons. I was able to achieve title around 3700 in Season 3, and barely made title again in Season 4, around 3660.
Alright, so today we're going to be doing a tier list video of how difficult each encounter is from the Season 4 Dragonflight dungeons, based off of our experiences. So Tachi is going to do the tank side of things, and I will be rating the boss difficulty for healers. Alright, we're gonna get started, starting with the very first boss on the list.
First boss here is Emberon from Uldaman. Emberon is pretty average, I would say. I think we just put him slightly just in average. You do have to pull a bunch of the animals, the bats, the spiders that jump around on top of the boss every single time, and the only real challenge is to make sure that the screeches from the ads get kicked. I do say that it is part of a VDH's job to kind of help corral the mobs up, so there's a layer of challenge to this, but it definitely isn't the hardest, nor is it the easiest. So a nice middle ground for Emberon here.
On the healer side, I'm going to put Emberon on the easy tier. Pretty much any bosses you will see today on the lower and easier side will be bosses where damage doesn't go out very frequently and there's more time to heal in between. So during the intermission, there's always constant taking damage, but it's very minimal. So even if you're down a healer, they're usually able to sustain.
All right, next up, we have Azureblade from Azurvault. I think Azureblade is slightly more difficult than Emberon. I will put it in the hard tier. For reasons that Azureblade does have a strong tank buster, you can dodge this by backflipping, but it isn't very consistent. You could use either backflip or Infernal Strike. But the difficult part of this is the randomness of the spawn of the ads. Of course, Vengeance Demon Hunter makes this pretty a lot easier than other tanks, let's just say, by having a lot of tools. You could silence the ad, you could misery them at the very end, so you don't have to deal with them. But it is still sort of difficult to try to balance having to go over to the ad and to make sure you kick. This is like a very big communication challenge for some groups, especially in pugs. For pre-made groups, it's not as bad, but I do add that to the hard list because I do believe that if someone dies and you could have interrupted the cast, it is still kind of your fault as a VDH. Even with the RNG factor, I wouldn't say this boss is unfair because you could still pretty easily live it. It's just you do have to do a lot.
On the healer side, I'm definitely going to put this on the can live if healer dies tier, because pretty much the only time you will need to heal on this fight is during the intermission. You're pretty much just DPSing the entire time, and if you happen to die, as long as it's not at the beginning of the fight, your team will most likely still get through the fight. If you run the Incarn build, then you can just save your big CDs for pretty much the only time damage goes out, and that's it.
Alright, next up is Balakar Khan. Balakar Khan for tanks, I would put as hard again. I would say it's definitely harder than Azureblade. It depends on what comp you're running as well. If you're running with an AUG, which I presume like 99% of the meta groups in Season 4 did, you could help a lot in Phase 1 by cauterizing off the bleed, which is pretty bad. It's usually the bleed into the Iron Hit combo that does a lot of damage. And then there's also like pretty annoying parts where he will leave a bleed on you right before he going into the intermission, so then you can't hit him to like heal back until the ads come out. But then at that point you're also like trying to get the ads grouped up and everything, so that bleed is pretty bad. Going into Phase 2, there's no more bleed, but the conductive strike does hit pretty hard, and sometimes you could get kind of turned around with how all the movement, with all the upheaval movements and all of that, and then you could get caught off guard with a conductive strike. I wouldn't say it's unfair, even though there's a lot going on that fight. It's not really in the unfair, but it's definitely harder than Azureblade.
On the healer side, I will actually put it on average, even though pretty much the only difficult part is the intermission. But on a Teera 19, during the intermission, it actually does a lot of damage. And if you don't pop your CDs properly, if you don't have your ramp going properly, if people don't have defenses, which they most likely will not, because DPS will be saving their defensives for the other parts that one-shot.
Okay, next up is Gutshot. Probably another average boss. Say it's easier than Emberon, so on the right. There's nothing much to say. The only thing that could catch you off guard is if the hyenas actually get to you and then get a bite off on you with the bleed. That could be pretty bad, but with the high assortment of CC options you have for them and just proper kiting and proper trap dropping, it shouldn't really be a big deal. But I do say it does have some level of this could go wrong, so I do put it in the average tier.
So for healing, this boss pretty much has no healing on this fight. You're just DPSing the entire time, unless somebody gets randomly shot, or sometimes the tank might need a little help with healing, but aside from that, you're pretty much just DPSing the entire fight.
Next up, we got the Overgrown Ancient. This is another boss that is pretty challenging on High Tyrannical. Some of the stuff that could be pretty deadly on Overgrown Ancient is the stacks from all the ads, and also kind of annoying when the ads spawn out of the first burst forth, and you would have to save certain abilities to get threat. Make sure that your mage don't just insta die off of getting threat from the ignite spread or something like that. The Bark Breaker makes you take more damage, and that could just lead to an instant one shot if you have too many stacks. It is definitely a boss that you could just instantly die to, or at least lose your cheat to.
So for healing, this is kind of a similar concept to Balakar Khan, because you have a bleed phase where you're taking tick damage constantly, and then you also have a AoE one-shot phase, which means you will have less defensives for the bleed phase, and Clothies on a 19 take more than 800k damage per tick, which is a lot. So you either need to cauterize them with an AUG, either have Dwarf Racial, or you just need to have big defensives for that.
Okay, next up we have Treemouth. Treemouth is definitely a boss that doesn't have a lot going on, but I would say it's still in the average tier, because normally on Brackenhide you're kind of just going through blazing fast, and you're gonna pull a massive chunk of trash onto the boss. So there could be a little bit of clutter. There could be some of those slimes that die underneath the boss, and then you kind of have to move along with the swirlies. But outside of that, Treemouth, pretty harmless. So I'll put him in the average. Definitely not as bad as some of these other bosses.
So Treemouth is probably the easiest boss of the season. There's pretty much no healing to do. You're pretty much just DPSing the entire fight. Assuming nobody gets hit by any swirlies, you make sure you AoE stop everything. Assuming you do all the mechanics correctly, you will basically not be taking damage.
Alright, moving on to the next one, we have Bromach. Alright, we have a heavy hitter here. Definitely somewhat challenging, and you're definitely expected to pull at least 2 of the Berserkers, if not 3, onto the boss in order to give him the debuff, and then that's going to significantly amp his damage up. You gotta move around, kick, make sure you bring all the ads on top of the totem. But honestly, after the Berserkers die, you're probably not going to die to just Bromach.
On the contrary, this is pretty much one of the hardest encounters for healers this season, just because the totems do a lot of damage. Even on an 18, it does more damage than a lot of the other fights on the same key level. You need to make sure you plan out all the defensives for each totem. The totems come out very often. Without help from other people using their own defensives, that you will not have enough CDs to survive through all the totems.
Chargath at the start of the season was an absolute terror, but after the round of nerfs, he definitely got a lot more tame, and people generally came up with like better strategies to break the chains better, and he's not that bad.
All right. Pretty much same thing for healing. He used to be a lot harder, but I would say he's average now. You only take damage when you're breaking chains, and then outside of that, you're pretty much just DPSing. You will have CDs up every single time. You will have Flourish. You will have your 1 minutes. If you run the Convoke build, you will have that every single time. So it's actually not that difficult.
Alright, we're gonna go straight to, this is Deios from Oldemon. It's not that bad. He definitely cannot really kill you as long as you have a defensive up for the one frontal that comes out every very long while, right? So he's the first one in easy.
For healing, he actually doesn't really do that much. It's pretty much you just survive the one shot. You have plenty of time in between to heal up, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, moving on. We have the Primal Storm. Oh yeah, right. It's called the Raging Tempest. You're right. After the very first hit, as long as you like pre-meta or brand to go in, and the first wind burst doesn't just one-shot you, you're pretty much okay. You're gonna run Purge. You're gonna get rid of the thing, and it's not really gonna be that bad. I say average, good place for him.
For healing, I would put it on the hard side. Although when you do have orbs, it's actually way more manageable. But on the very first storm, you will not have max orbs most likely because it comes out pretty quickly. You will pretty much have to rely on your team to step all the way into the middle. You have to drop your F-flow in the middle, make sure all your teammates are standing in it. Just note that your team will have to use defensives for the regular AoE burst damage outside of the storm. So they're going to go into this phase with very minimal defensives.
Alright, next up we got the Lost Dwarves. The primary thing is just you gotta make sure that the frontals are not facing your teammates, and that's pretty much it. The frontals themselves don't actually hurt that bad, so I would say Dwarves, another average, but I definitely say it's gonna be a little bit more hectic than some of these other bosses in the average tier. I would say on a similar level to Emberon.
For healing, I would put Dwarves on the easy side, but I'm going to put it harder than Emberon because Emberon is still predictable. While on Dwarves, if the ricocheting shield or the arrow combos and goes on a squishy target, such as your priest, they can actually die without externals.
Okay, next up we have Echo of Doragosa. This is a boss that is pretty unilaterally just harmless. You're not going to die to this. You can stand in every single mechanic and you will not die. Even bringing the ads in, the only thing you're actually worried about is whether if your team is going to die.
For healing, there is almost no healing outside of maybe when somebody gets the random overwhelming power stack. So there's one that usually blows up after a few seconds, or you can dispel it, and then there's another one that's random. So if you don't top them up fast enough, they could get 2 in a row and just RNG die. But aside from that, not really difficult. I'm pretty much DPSing the entire fight.
Alright, next up we have Decatriarch Wratheye. The only challenge here is actually figuring out how to do the correct amount of DPS on the totems, and the tank does play somewhat of a part into this. You're running Grief Torch, you are trying to maximize some of the damage that you can do in a specific window. Sometimes she does give a giant heal absorb, and that could be a little bit troublesome, but nothing really to the point that you're going to get one shot over. So
kind of the same concept for healing. I would say it's on the easy side. There is pretty much nothing to heal. Every once in a while there's an AoE that happens. The only difficulty is if a totem does go off, then you will have to heal the whole time. But the hard part is pretty much just CPSing. Even as a healer, especially as a Resto Druid, you will have to maximize your DPS in order to make the totems.
Okay, next up we have Granyth from Nokud. Nothing much to say for this guy. He can melee you for a bit. Assuming you're doing the mass entangle strat, you're just going to drag him over to the side and you just hit him, get out of the circle once, and that's pretty much it.
This is also a pretty simple fight for healers. As long as you click on the ballistas every time it spawns, you're not going to get a second AoE.
Okay, Next up, we have Watcher Irideus. I'm assuming you're going to be pulling one pack of the trash into the boss. So I'd say he's probably harder than Treemouth now, but still pretty simple.
For healing, I would say he's harder than all of these bosses in the average tier, so I'm gonna put him in hard. But for Resto Druid specifically, I would say he's actually not that hard. As long as you have a CD up for every single pulsing damage that goes out and you ramp properly, you should be able to survive the boss. I have a guide on this in another video. I'll link it down below if you want to see it. But yeah, I wouldn't say he's like impossible to do. You just need CDs for it.
Alright, Khajin for tanks it's not that hard. I would say it's around this range because you're definitely not bringing any trash. Probably still harder than Treemouth because you are responsible for the movement, and the movement is pretty deliberate. And depending on the group, like if you're just playing a full range group, it is a lot easier.
So for healing, it's actually not as difficult as people think for Resto Druids. You have your CDs to rotate in between. You usually have Lust for this boss, so that is a CD for 40 seconds. But I will still put her in this tier because you still need help from other people. So you still need to rotate Zephyr, you still need to rotate your Mass Barrier, you still need to rotate all your personals and everything off cooldown. You will still go on this fight if it's a high enough key. And if you don't manage your CDs properly, you can still fall behind on this boss.
Okay, next up we have Kokia Blazehoof, second boss, Ruby. He's definitely a lot harder of a hitter than some of these others. I would say he's kind of on the same level of Azureblade, except a little bit less on the management, because all you need to do is really just kick and add, and then make sure you have defensive for the Searing Blow. But definitely he hits much harder, and then you're also kind of dictating where he moves, so the movement is also another challenge for this boss.
Alright, for healers, this is actually a pretty hard encounter. Mainly because for every Inferno, it already almost one-shots you, even through defensive. And most people are going to front-load their defensive for the initial tick of the Inferno, and you're going to have to heal through the rest of the ticks.
Alright, next up we have Crawth. Crawth for tanks is a very, very textbook, just average boss. There's no movement, if any, at all. You're basically just saving a CD every time he pecks you, and sometimes maybe the fifth Screech could hurt if you're doing 5 stacks. But pretty much you have a defensive up for every peck, and you're good.
On the healing side, it's hard to rank because technically you have plenty of time in between each AoE, and it's more about surviving each one shot. On a 19, you're most likely going to have to survive through 2 5 stacks.
Alright, next up we have Sargha. Pretty easy, especially if you're just doing the boss by itself. You are expected to bring maybe 1 or 2 adds into it, but even still, it's not that bad. The curse damage from grabbing an item is negligible.
For healers, there's almost no healing on this fight, except for sometimes the dot goes out. So it's more than Gutshot and Treemouth, but minimal healing, one of the easiest encounters of the season.
Okay, next up, this is Kyrakka and Erkhart. I would say this is the first entry into the unfair tier. The Tank Buster is manageable, but it comes pretty quickly. You need to have defensive for it every single time, otherwise you're definitely losing cheat or dying for it. But the difficulty of it is once phase 2 starts and Erkhart hops onto Kyrakka's back, now you're not really able to get good stacking of your frailty on the boss, and then you're just going to be taking a lot of damage. You could also take overlap damage with the fire spit damage plus a buster or something like that, and that could get you killed.
This is one of those fights where it's equally as hard for healing If you get the overlap of the Flame Spit plus the Cloudburst, you're pretty much just dead unless you pop double defensives.
Alright, next up, we got back-to-back bangers. We got Leymor. This is definitely, undoubtedly, the hardest boss for tanks of the entire season. Leymor, you got multiple things that can kill the tank. You have a very, very tough buster that leaves a nasty dot. You can dodge the frontal by doing a backflip Infernal Strike combo, but then you kind of have to aim the frontal to clear as many trees as possible, and then you have to worry about the threat generation on the little ads, and then you also have to worry about whether some groups are not killing the ads fast enough, and then the ads are going to leave the sappy burst under you when you need to stand still or position the boss a very specific way. So when you have like that kind of like stuff going on, and also like whenever all the trees are being popped at the same time, now you have to go in, grab all the ads, and then unless if you're in a, again, coordinated group, not everyone is going to cooperate with you and make that easy. Some people are just going to start hitting, and then you're going to lose threat, and then having to try to gather threat during that period of time can get you killed because you're trying to focus on something else other than living, and the boss definitely is pretty unforgiving.
For healing, it's actually not that hard, but the hard part is having to top people in between the explosive brand and the consuming stomp. And it's not only hard because you have to top them up very quickly, but also because there's going to be a lot of saplings that you might get threat on. And you have to be careful to position yourself in a way where your tank can pick up the ads and they don't just instantly melee you, because that has happened before.
Next up, we have Magmatusk. Magmatusk is okay. You're going to bring some ads onto Magmatusk, but they're going to pretty quickly die. You can just front load all the CDs at that point, and there's really not that much of a challenge afterwards. But there is some movement challenges with having to keep him outside of the lava pool so he doesn't get the empower, but average is a good spot.
Originally, I was going to say that Magmatusk is on the hard tier, but I'm actually going to move him up to the need help from others tier, because if you do get the breath, in between ticks of the volatile mutation, you could die. The ticks hurt a lot on a 19, and towards the end of the fight, they get longer and longer to the point where it's pretty much like Khajin by the end of the fight. The only reason why I put it easier than Khajin is because the beginning is easy. It gets harder and harder, and towards the end, it gets very hard.
Next up, Melidrussa, I would say, is another absolute crankster of a boss. Melidrussa is definitely more patterned. The damage could be a little bit random at some points, like you could just be taking absolute huge amounts of damage. There's that one famous clip of the this is my first Ruby life pool of the season, and then boom, tank dead. That could happen at any level because Melidrussa has a absolutely brutal melee into the first Ice Shard combo. If you don't have anything going into the boss, you are absolutely dead. Even if you live the initial engagement, afterwards, you have to deal with all of the Chillstorm procs. Every time that explodes, you're also taking a huge amount of damage. It could overlap with Ice Shard. That just deals so much damage. When the ads come out, you have to get threat on it quickly. Melidrussa, definitely a very tough boss.
It's definitely on the rough side for healing too. I would say it's harder than all these other bosses. Not only do you have to survive the Chillstorm explosion itself, but there is ticking damage before the Chillstorm actually explodes, and most of the time you need people to either use their own health pots, they either need to use their own defensives, you need to have like a big CD. A lot of people use the strat on hierarchies where they actually don't kick that pulse damage because that is actually less bad than getting more chill storms. So they want to get the boss as low as possible so they can avoid as many chill storms as possible. That is how bad that chill storm is.
Okay. Next up, we have the first boss of Brackenhide, the Warband. This boss is alright. It could hit pretty hard sometimes, but in general, you basically are just working on the rotation of kicks, and there's really nothing special to it here. I would say like over here in average.
Alright, I'm gonna put him in the easy tier. If you have a way to deal with him For every bleed, you either have caught, you either have ward, or you have any defensive. As long as you're topped, the bleed goes away. Aside from that, there's not really much damage going up.
Next up, we have Sentinel Talondras. This one is, I would say, one of the bosses that highly increased in difficulty because of the ads that you have to pull in. And I would say he deserves a spot in the hard tier because of that. You have to make sure that his stun charges are always there. Sometimes you're not going to be able to like drag him through the orbs all the time. You have to be careful not to get knocked into them yourself. And then on top of it, you have to watch out for the ads that are like trying to bite you, get you a bleed, and you just instantly die or proc or something like that. And then you have to CC those ads. And then if the boss gets the Titanic Empowerment, it's pretty much instantly doomed. If you're doing this boss just by itself, then pretty much it doesn't do much. And I would say he's like in the easy tier. So I would say having the ads on the boss does make this boss much more challenging.
Okay, so on the healing side, this is crazy. It's one of the hardest bosses of the season, I would say. Because you can get overlaps of the bleed into the knockback or the knockback into the bleed. If you get that, you're just dead. And the only way you can prevent that is try to coordinate stuns with your tank, with other people that have stuns, coordinate defensives, externals, caught. You might use a few B-reses on this fight. Even on the highest keys that I've seen pros do, they die on this boss, and they use their B-reses on this boss. So that is how difficult it is.
All right, we got the Gulping Goliath up next. Gulping Goliath is just a, same old song and dance. I think being a VDH definitely makes this boss a lot easier. You're not really taking much of the damage. Even if you stand in the circle that he lands on, you're not really gonna die. His movement challenge is like about the same as Deios. You're just dragging him back and forth in the room, and then you use your stops to stop the frogs, the little frogs inside the circle, make sure he eats them, and that's pretty much it.
For healing, this is probably about average. The only thing is when the ads spawn, it does huge AoE pulsing damage, but you pretty much just need your team to pop defensives. If you do your ramp properly, people have a CD for it, or if you have a CD for it, then you should just be able to survive.
Okay, next one is the Forgemaster. Forgemaster for tank is actually not that bad. You're just doing the same song and dance. That's pretty much it. The other things don't really pertain to you as a tank. So I would say he's in the easy tier. The ground effect, you could get caught up in those, but as long as you're paying attention, it's fine. He doesn't melee that hard. So easy boss for the tank.
For healing, he does do a lot of damage, so I would still put him in the hard tier. If you have melts for the Aegis, like the thing that plants a circle below you, and you can just get rid of that, then you're basically just getting rid of half the mechanics on the fight. But assuming that you get unlucky and you get all of the mechanics on the fight, you might run out of CDs. And then another thing is you also have to move, and there's swirlies on the ground everywhere. So you have to time your healing to make sure you are healing people, but also dodging swirlies. That is the hard part.
Next up, we have Teera and Maruuk. Teera and Maruuk for the tank is not that bad. You basically just have a defensive up every single time Maruuk goes for the brutalize on you. You just don't get clapped by that, and you're chilling. That could still catch some people off guard. I would say he's somewhere here along the lower end of average. There's not too much lethality to the tank, and the movement is pretty telegraphed. You just see where it's jumping to, you just drag it over, and you're good.
So originally I had Teera and Maruuk above Talondras. However, I have not done Talondras successfully on a 19, and I have done Teera and Maruuk. The reason is because Teera and Maruuk are more predictable, and you can play around it. Gale Arrow is always guaranteed. You always know you're saving cooldown for that. As long as you don't get one shot by the shoots, then you should be good. But the hard part about this fight is you have to top people very quickly. If people are not topped, they're instantly dead.
Okay. Telash Greywing. For tanks, he's okay. Very predictable pattern of damage, so nothing too bad. It's again like I think it's just press buttons and you'll live. But he could catch you off guard sometimes. Like, you basically need to have a defensive up whenever he does the absolute zero, because you're not able to keep your stacks during that time. So then at that point, you know, you have something for when he comes right back down and hits you. But outside of that, that's pretty much it. You're not going to die to anything else.
So for healing, the damage on this fight is pretty predictable. There's always the same amount of damage going out. It doesn't do that much damage. Pretty much on the easy side. If there's a small window between Frostbomb and the absolute zero is when it's going to be hard. But since the rest of the fight isn't hard, you can just always save your CDs. You can save your Flourish. You can save your Incarn for that overlap specifically. So overall, pretty easy fight.
Okay, next one we have Umbryskull. All right, he does hit pretty hard. He has one of the hardest hitting busters in this season. I would say it's harder than Azureblade, just because of there's still movement that needs to be done. There's still, you know, just having to manage that that buster is pretty brutal. But outside of that, it's okay.
Umbryskull is pretty easy for healing as well, because most of the time you're playing around your DPS's CDs. Your CDs will most likely come back up faster than a DPS's CDs will. You have 1 minute CDs as a Resto Druid, and as long as your DPS are doing their job and killing the crystals, you're pretty much not really in danger.
Okay, moving on. This is the Primal Tsunami. This is another boss that is very, very annoying for the tank due to the randomness. The orb spawn can be manipulated somewhat by kind of stacking together with the rest of the group, but you can't really do too much about the ones that spawn right underneath the boss. Those are the ones that are really going to get you. The gauntlet is not that bad, and then afterwards he's going to do even more damage. The buster is pretty hard to sustain. I would say it's you would need at least like 1.5 CDs or like the healer pumping heals into you. So pretty brutal boss, I would say, for the tank.
For healing, I would say this is one of the easier ones. So it's kind of the same idea as Crawth, except even easier. The AoE doesn't come out nearly as often, and you have plenty of time to top people off before the next AoE goes out. You might have to help heal the tank a little bit if they are low on CDs when the tank buster comes out. But aside from that, not really much healing to do, and you're mostly just DPSing on that boss.
Okay, and the last boss that we have here is Veximus. Pretty hard hitting, and you do have a lot of moving around to do. You have to soak the orbs. You have to also think about when to feed the orb to Veximus at a certain point in order to prevent having the overlap of the mana bomb plus knockback and whatnot. Frontal hurts pretty badly. The soaking, if you have a lot of stacks, it could hurt, but you're going to get dispelled, hopefully. So yeah, he's not the hardest, but definitely pretty challenging.
Veximus is probably one of the harder bosses this season as well, just because it is very hard to heal the mana bombs. It's kind of the same idea as Melidrussa, where you want to be topped before the final explosion goes out. There's just less damage going out on this fight compared to Melidrussa, and the Arcane Fissure is not really that deadly unless it is overlapping with a mana bomb. But if you play the fight correctly and you let an orb in between at the right time, you should not get an overlap.
Okay, and that's it for all of these Season 4 bosses. There are much more bosses in the hard and unfair tier and like average to difficult. And like I would say any of these average bosses could be considered hard on a bad day. So that makes the season just a lot more difficult compared to Season 3, where you have some dungeons where you just get a lot of bosses that are just completely free.
Also, to add, if the bottom tier is a 5, the top tier is a 10. Versus last season, the bottom tier, all the easy bosses were very easy. Like, they were probably like a 1, while the hardest bosses were like a 9. So even though we have a tier list going on right now, it was really hard to rank because a lot of them were pretty close in difficulty.
And just a quick look on some of the comparisons as to whether if we have some bosses that are very similar. We can see we have both Melidrussa and Kyrakka in the highest difficulty tier, which, you know, out of 2 out of the 3 bosses in Ruby Life Pools is hard for both the tank and the healer, which just makes the dungeon pretty difficult. There are some contrasting opinions, such as Leymor being a little bit further off, and Teera and Maruuk being way further off, but it's just something to note. So you can kind of see how some of these bosses could be the real breaking point in Tyrannical weeks.
Alright, and that's about it for this video. Let me know what you guys think, and do you guys agree or not? Or if you play a different class, how differently would you rate these bosses? I know for healing, Resto Druid is one of a kind this season. It was by far the best healer to deal with a lot of these bosses. If you guys like this video, let me know if you want to see more of these in future seasons. But yep, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video.